Hi, everyone. My name is Ani Dasgupta. I'm the CEO and president of WRI, and I'm very, very delighted to be moderating today's discussion. We have really truly an outstanding panel today. So on behalf of all of us, welcome, and thank you very much for being here. As we enter the second half of this critical decade, this is a moment I think we all feel that we need to move beyond familiar narrative. Global temperatures are continuing to break records, and all of you know that. And crossing 1.5 degree is no longer kind of a distant warning. But a lot of progress is being made on renewables and transport. These are real. This is happening. But we haven't yet seen economy-wide transformation that we all need. Unfortunately, emissions are still rising. Fossil fuel expansion continues. And change across many sectors remain rather slow. In WRI, with a lot of partners publish every year a state of climate report, which has 45 indicators, not about what commitments people have made, but what actual changes are happening in the economy. And last year, just before COP, when we published this report, not one of the 45 indicators were anywhere near meeting the 2030 goals targets. So that's the context of today's discussion, and today's discussion convened by the Allied for Climate Transformation Consortium, or ACT. This conversation is not about whether we need more action. Absolutely, we do. There is no debate on that. That is very obvious. It's about what is the climate playbook? Where are we falling short, and what is it that we need to do differently? What decision we make to make differently? What partnership we need to genuinely change direction, not incrementally, but like real game-changing step change we all realize we need. So that is the the framing or focus of the discussion. The thing that is obvious to all of us is that the current affairs are falling short, but the climate impact is intensifying. Deaths are mounting, inequity is rising. And for vulnerable countries for Global South, this race against time to build resilience is not just to survive, but to thrive. So that is where we're trying to get to. I just want to introduce our fantastic panel. If you can have them on the screen, I just want to introduce them. Before you can see it on your screen. We're joined by Mary Robinson, former President of the Republic of Ireland, former UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, members of the Elders. We're joined by Honorable Ralph Regenbanu. Thank you for being here. Minister of Climate, Climate Change, Meteorology, Geohazard, Energy, Environment, and Disaster Management in Vanuatu. You'll hear from him. He has a very important portfolio. Dr. Vera Songwe will join us in a few minutes. Chair and founder of Liquidity and Sustainability Facility and the Senior Fellow at Brookings. Ms. Rachel Kite, UK Representative for Climate. Ms. Maria Fernanda Torres Penagos, Director of Climate Change and Risk Management, Colombia. And my friend, Mr. Mohamed Ado, Director of PowerShift Africa and ACT 2025 partner. Welcome to all of you. You will meet all of them in a minute, one by one. Before we proceed, I really would like, if it's possible, to invite all our ACT partners who helped build this coalition for many years and make this event possible. You already met Mohammed, then Gabriel Swabi from WRI, Mark Bayon, yeah, there you are. Tony Lavina of Manila Observatory. Mark is from the Caribbean Community Climate Change Center. Jacques Okerere from the Center of Climate Change and Development, A.E. Funia, and Shakib Haq from the International Climate Change and Development. And a big shout out to our partners in Transforma who couldn't join us today. So thank you all. I mean, all of you have together, not only we work together, you're put together this dedicated group of thought leaders and been real partners with Global South, been working together for 5 years. Specifically, I just want to highlight to bring climate issue in vulnerable countries in focus in various fora, not just in COPs, but various fora. We at WR have been a privilege to be part of this group, part of this partnership. And at this critical juncture, we very much think collectively, this is a moment for us to pause and reflect where we are. This is the part of this discussion today from all these eminent people, and kickstart, ideas of what we need to do going forward. How should we regroup? Who should we be working with? What kind of partnership we want? So that is a moment for us also to reflect. I just want to tell you, we will leave a lot of time for Q&A today after we have the panel discussion. So please put your questions answer in the button below. So I want to get started. Thank you all for being here. I just want to start before we turn to the panel. It's a real privilege, me personally and for all of us, to have Mary here. Mary is, I think, one of the most influential voices to ensuring not only climate change is understood, but is acted upon as a matter of justice and human rights. That is where I think Mary has really shaped our thinking. So Mary, many, many thanks to you for being in touch. I'm really delighted and honored to invite you to offer your opening remarks and get us started. Mary, over to you.
Well, thank you, Annie. And it is an honor and truly daunting to give a keynote in front of such a distinguished panel, any of whom could have been a wiser choice. Luckily, Annie, you sent me your book and I read it over the Christmas holiday break. And I note that you completed it before Trump's second term started. So it's on the optimistic side. But still, I think even then there was a rude awakening, but now we have a rude awakening indeed, because we have the first anniversary, and even yesterday and today, everything is moving so fast. We have to keep up. I'm sure in his speech, he'll say something that will shock us again, as he always tries. But Annie, the essentials in your book remain correct. We must recognize that we have finite resources, human, financial, and political, and at our disposal, and that we are running out of time, seriously running out of time. So I propose to adapt your analysis, if you like, to our current, far more harsh reality. And unfortunately, it is a harsh reality. I hope some panel members will take this even further. Yes, we do need to shift our mindset again and do it rapidly. Clearly, protecting nature is part of addressing climate change, but we need to go further. And we need to see ourselves as nature, as our indigenous communities do, part of nature. And I became even more aware of this when I was invited to join the Guardians of the Planetary Boundaries and to work with Johan Rockström on his work with the Potsdam Institute, because we see the interconnectedness between these 9 ecosystems that sustain us in a livable world, frankly, and how close we are getting to the tipping points in that world. Scientists are warning we're likely to breach, from a climate perspective, the 1.5 degrees goal by the end of this decade, which is at least 10 years earlier than scientists had thought. And yet, we also see incredible initiatives. I was intrigued recently to hear a friend talk of the potential of the new concept of poly-intelligence. The coming together of human intelligence with both machine intelligence and nature's intelligence. AI models could help decode the incredibly complex and logic and intelligence of the natural world. And it happens that one of my fellow guardians of the planetary boundaries, Omar Yaghi, got the Nobel Prize for Chemistry in 2024 for his innovative work in capturing water out of air And the same process can also capture carbon. I agree that we need a systematic economic transition and the politics to make it happen. Perhaps the unraveling of rule of law and the assertion of rule by power will bring home the unacceptable nature of the economic dominance by less than a dozen tech billionaires. I frankly need help from our panel in knowing how to break out of the rampant capitalist system that that provides for a grossly unequal world that has lost its legitimacy. That's beyond climate, but it's also the framework within which we're trying to tackle the climate issue. We need to face up to what is not working. We are significantly off track, and scientists warn us we are likely, as I say, to break through the 1.5 degree goal before the end of the decade. So newly submitted NDCs, 130 in total in Belém, are of better quality, but collectively still fall far short of what is needed. We need to make full use of the first international conference for the just transition from fossil fuels in Colombia at the end of April. And I commend Colombia and also the Netherlands for this initiative. It's not competing with the UNFCCC. It's now a necessary complement to it, because unfortunately, the UNFCCC has been so invaded by the fossil fuel lobby that it is incapable now of including in its outcomes that we must phase out of fossil fuel. Imagine. It seems ridiculous, but it is the reality. So we need a space where we talk about phasing out with just transition equitably, and we need that space to honor the science, to let the science speak to us with no caveats and no hesitation. I think, you know, it's really important that we understand the extent to which rule of law is unraveling. You know, Prime Minister Carney in Davos yesterday described what Trump has done as a rupture, not a transition. But I think we also need to be aware that other leaders have not followed Trump in pulling out of the Paris Agreement and now the UNFCCC and other UN agencies and other international organizations. It hasn't happened. So we are still in time to secure the rules-based order. But what we need urgently is reform of the United Nations, because we know it's not fit for purpose. It's not just Trump overstating that. It's not fit for purpose because it reflects the world of 1945. We need an Article 106 review process. It's already mounting a lot of attention, and we need to do it urgently so that we balance the multipolar world within the Security Council. We also need to balance it within the Bretton Woods institutions. And all this is happening, the war in Ukraine, the grab by Trump or attempted grab of Greenland and perhaps more, and the so-called Board of Peace. I've looked at the charter of a Board of Peace. Do you know what it is? It's a board of the power of one person, Trump. He's chair, he does everything. You read the charter, you have to laugh, and yet countries seem to think they should subscribe to it. And all of this is happening as we face the existential threat of the climate and nature crisis. So we have the ICJ ruling, which is very helpful now in future litigation. We're going to see more litigation, and I think in the countries that look to the International Court of Justice, we will see that there will be more breakthroughs. But actually, what we need to do is change the narrative. And the way of changing the narrative is to make it more human and to make it from the heart. And how do we do that? I think we begin by talking about justice, because the injustices of the climate and nature crisis are overwhelming. The fact that it impacts far more severely and for far longer the poorest countries, the poorest communities, the small island states, the indigenous communities, and they are the least responsible. Secondly, there is a gender dimension. Women are very often without power, without ownership of land, without the proper training, without a seat at the table. And yet they are the ones on the ground who are changing their communities, building their resilience. Networks and networks of women are doing what they're doing without climate finance. So little climate finance reaches them. The third injustice is the injustice, obviously, to nature herself. The loss of species, which is shocking. The whole approach that we have of ignoring or mercantiling nature, not being of nature, as I've emphasized. And the fourth injustice I'd like to touch on is very real. It's an injustice of the pathways to development of different regions. Europe, the United States, Japan, Korea, we built our economies on fossil fuel. So our obligation is to wean ourselves off fossil fuel as rapidly as possible with just transition in our countries and just transition for the world. Developing countries are angry now. I've just come from the Mo Ibrahim meeting where I heard the anger of African countries that we don't want them to develop their oil and gas. And yet we know that if they do develop their oil and gas, they will be the first to suffer. And probably by the time they do it, they won't be able to sell it profitably because they'll be undercut by Saudi Arabia and the United States with its fracking. So it is very unfair. And the last injustice is the intergenerational injustice, and that is being so eloquently spoken about now by school children. And it maybe is at the heart of what I'm saying. We make this a human endeavor together. We create movements of movements. I'm working with a lot of other women leaders inspired by a weed, the dandelion, because it grows on all continents. It's very resilient. It has deep roots that regenerate the soil, and you blow the seeds, and you wish as you blow. So it's a perfect symbol because it's also nature. But we need, as well as that, coalitions of the willing who are serious about the issues that underlie the rules-based order. And that is human rights. It is the right to a healthy environment. It is all the gains we've had, which we must hold on to. And we will do it if we speak the language of the heart, if we show that we are at risk. We could lose the coral reefs in less than a decade. Come on. We could lose the Amazon in a little more time than that. I mean, this is what moves people, shocks them, but also tells them this doesn't have to happen. We have the political will. If we can change where the money is going, if we can switch the leadership approaches, the mindset approaches, we can and we must do what is impossible. Because as Nelson Mandela said, it always seems impossible until it is done. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mary. Thank you for being here. First of all, I just, as you know, I love your focus and framing of justice as the fulcrum of this discussion, which is something very central to this. Mary, as we move on to the panel, one of the things this discussion is about playbook. What should we do, organize, or think differently? And you've been so innovative in many ways. Dandelion that you have pulled together as an example of that, to how to mobilize. And you said hearts, we have to focus on hearts and minds, not just technology and solutions. As we move on to the panel, I wonder if you would share any thoughts you have about, where we find ourselves in a very, as you opened your speech, in a very difficult moment in multiple ways. We thought we had won the narrative debate of whether climate change is good for growth or not. And today the world is discussing otherwise. I just wonder if you have some thoughts, advice for all of us as we move to the panel about playbook. What should we be doing or thinking differently?
Well, what I've been thinking about is how we can marshal our resources much more urgently and look at the short-term opportunities. And I think the Colombia first opportunity to look at phasing out fossil fuel with just transition. We've never looked at that in a wholehearted way, in a genuine way, in an honest way, which takes in the justice dimension. If we can do that, it starts us, and if we can build this coalition, which is governments and international institutions, but layered below that is business, is philanthropy, is filmmakers, is artists, is the whole movements, is women leaders, etc. And somehow be determined that the rules-based order is utterly vital to our future. It's beyond the climate and nature crisis. It is quite fearful to think that we would unravel something so precious. I mean, I find it unbelievably startling, if I could put it that way, that we are looking at the possibility through one man's arrogant, narcissistic, unbelievable power grab and the fear of others. Let's get over the fear factor. Let's work together hard to preserve our rules-based order, and within that have much more focus on what we really need to do, which is to address phasing out fossil fuel with just transition and safeguarding and regenerating nature with just transition.
Thank you, Mary. Mary, thank you for being here. I'm sure the Columbia conference in April will come up in our panel in a few minutes. I know a lot of people in the panel are very keenly interested in that, and that's a real opportunity. Us at WRL very interested. How can we support it? Mary, I hope you stay. Thank you for being here. It's an absolute pleasure and privilege.
I'll stay, pleasure, and listen to the panel and await the questions. Yes.
Thank you. Let's move on to our panel. I really want to start with Minister Riganvanu. Please, if you can come on screen there you are. First of all, I just want to acknowledge to all our participant listeners how late it is in Vanuatu right now. So I just want to thank you from the bottom of my heart for being part of us and your commitment and being in this conversation. I wanted to start where Mary just was talking about, the justice dimension. And one of the most injustice things in the world is what island nations face already, from rising sea level. A group of people who had very little to do with climate change actually are impacting the most. Recently Australia moved to issue visas for Pacific Islanders to resettle. It's a kind of a signal of progress, but also migration is a huge issue for family, right? I mean, it's a solution, but I wonder if you would start us off from your perspective, from the communities and families and nations that are facing the crisis most. What would be game-changing things or action we must take together? Over to you, Ralph.
Well, thank you very much for having me on this panel. It's great to be able to contribute to this discussion. And I want to start off where Mary ended, about the importance of the rules-based order. So if we talk about what truly game-changing actions we need to take at this time in history, it's really, I would focus on two. We need to act in accordance with the science, and the IPCC is recognized as the best available science. And we need to act in accordance with international law. And now we have the ICJ advisory opinion, which has clarified that. So I know this sounds like a broken record. We've been repeating this same message for over 30 years now. And perhaps I also sound naive in the context of, what we're seeing today with the flagrant disregard for international law. And we see the actions of many states engaging in renewed conflicts driven by oil and gas extraction, continued public finance flows to subsidize planet-destroying industries. And we're seeing many states retreating from and obstructing these multilateral climate and environmental protection treaties and instruments. The plastics treaty negotiations, for example, stalled. I was at the IMO talking about trying to establish the world's first industry-wide GHG levy, and that was delayed. And then the COP30 in Belém. actions that are willfully not in accordance with the science and willfully not in accordance with international law. So we need to start there. In terms of security, which seems to be the buzzword nowadays, the Pacific Island nations have unequivocally stated that climate change remains the single greatest threat to the livelihood, security, and well-being of the peoples of the Pacific. So last year's ICJ advisory opinion has provided critical and I believe game-changing clarification of existing international law that states have binding obligations to take all necessary measures to curb emissions, including through the regulation of corporations and public finance institutions operating under their jurisdiction. So this is what the science, the IPCC, has been telling us needs to happen for too many years. And so now science and international law now concur with the advisory opinion handed down 6 months ago. The opinion reinforces what Vanuatu and many SIDS have long argued, that states cannot resource climate harm through public finance and then claim that it lies outside their legal responsibility. Every new fossil fuel development increases loss and damage for nations that did the least to cause this crisis, like my own, including now, as you mentioned with Tuvalu, human displacement and mobility. So in this context, true leadership means ending new fossil fuel expansion, phasing out existing production in line with 1.5 degrees Celsius, and ending subsidies that prop up polluting industries. And redirecting public finance from fossil fuels towards renewable energy is a concrete, achievable action that meets all the pillars of the COP agenda: mitigation, by reducing future emissions; adaptation, by limiting future climate impacts; the climate finance we always talk about, by deploying capital where it creates long-term stability rather than increase risk; and by advancing the equity and justice principles that underpin the Paris Agreement. The climate finance that we agreed upon in Paris and argued over at Belém is already there if we redirect. And that's a key direction or action that needs to happen. So for small island development states like my own, the current trajectory of global heating is catastrophic. It virtually guarantees that the 1.5 degrees Celsius limit will be breached. It accelerates irreversible loss and damage, and pushes nations like my own towards climate impacts beyond our capacity to adapt to. If unchecked, this path leads not only to injustice, but to runaway climate catastrophe, especially for us that have contributed least to the crisis. So to give an example from the islands, just 2 degrees of warming, 99% of tropical coral reefs are projected to die. Science tells us that we have already reached this tipping point. So these are entire life support systems for our food, our protection, and our identity gone. And let me be clear, no amount of carbon removal can resurrect a dead reef that is woven into the destiny of our communities or reverse the centuries of sea level rise already locked in. For Vanuatu and our indigenous Pacific family, this loss and damage is not only about money and infrastructure. It is the grief of leaving graves and sacred places to the tides. It's the breaking of language and knowledge when key plants and fishing grounds disappear. And it's a deep wound to our identity when the land and our people and the spirit that connects them are torn apart. Testimonies from our people, many of which we presented at the ICJ 2 years ago, document how climate change erodes traditional medicines, interrupts ceremonies, and tears at the heart of our mental health and social cohesion. So the overshoot trajectory we're on makes these losses permanent. And remember, the most vulnerable states like my own are simply living the future that we are all starting to face. Despite what Trump may say in the US, for example, the relentless and ever worsening disasters in the USA will be more persuasive for US citizens than he can ever be. But I want to come back to what I was saying at the beginning of my answer to this question. We in the Pacific and the vulnerable states are not asking for sympathy. We are insisting on integrity. Act in accordance with the science, act in accordance with international law. If the path of overshoot which we are on, because we are not acting in this way, means knowingly crossing these thresholds from which we will never return, then true ambition is the only moral economy we have left. And Vanuatu, of course, has been pushing the highest ambition in our actions. As a state, we have taken the climate crisis to the highest international legal forums, to the International Tribunal of the Law of the Sea to address carbon pollution of the oceans, and that advisory opinion was handed down in 2024, to the International Court of Justice to clarify states' climate obligations and the legal consequences of their breach, and that was handed down in July last year, and now at the International Criminal Court to advance the recognition of ecocide as another crime against humanity. I believe these actions are game-changing and that this will become apparent in years to come. These actions reflect a commitment to accountability, justice, and the protection of our people, cultures, and ecosystems, and we have to mirror them, and we are mirroring them in decisive domestic and regional action to address loss and damage, strengthen resilience, and safeguard the rights of present and future generations. And we invite all leaders, real leaders, to stand with us in these actions to uphold the rule of international law, respect for the UN Charter, and the protection of human and environmental rights for all. Thank you.
Ralph, thank you very much. Thank you for being such a forceful and eloquent speaker on this, not only just physically what's happening, but what's the human cost of what's happening. So thank you. I do want to, if we have time, I want to come back to later. You mentioned, this focus on, rule of law, and Mary talked about it. I wonder if I can come back to you on the ICJ. What could we do differently given the advisory as we move forward? I'll come back to you. Let me go to our other panelists, because Rachel, I would like to come to you next. Very connected. Rachel, thank you very much for being here.
Happy to be here.
Rachel, just the obvious, with all the pledges we saw in Belém, some are, as Mary said, they're better quality. They are better quality, but they are, fall far short of what the science demand. At the same time, there's a fracturing going on, which we all thought climate was something that needed collaboration among countries for the longest time. And now there is this competitiveness among countries that is, whether real or perceived, but that is what is the milieu right now. The question I have, which is something I know you think about, how do we take what geopolitical competition that's going on right now to the cooperation, or what is UK is trying to do, because to deliver results? How do we turn this to a cooperative arrangement that we absolutely need to make progress?
Well, thank you, Annie, and thank you to everybody appearing on the panel, and to Mary. Following Ralph is never easy. He has been a bellwether for so many of us for so long, and we owe him more action than words. But here's my take on things. So just stepping back, I'll come to the UK towards at the end of my comments. But look, I mean, I think everybody's already mentioned Mark Carney like 3 times because of his powerful speech yesterday at Davos. But he just went to China and secured an extraordinary sort of set of trade deals between Canada and China, including basically pivoting from being locked into a fleet of internal combustion engine vehicles imported over their southern border to basically completely eviscerating the tariff on Chinese electric vehicles. And so if you're a middle class Canadian, you're going to be driving a Chinese electric vehicle going forward. Right. So I think that the difficulty of this particular moment is that the old world order, as he said yesterday, is sort of shot to pieces. And while we build a new one, which won't happen quickly or easily, we have to find the ways to cooperate on the issues where we absolutely have to cooperate. And that includes our joint mission around climate change, while we re-engineer the coalitions and the alliances that align with a world where the old alliances have broken down. So you called this session Shifting Course. I think it's clear that we have to sort of tack differently, but the point on the horizon to which we're all headed hasn't changed. The science didn't change. Now, of course, the further off course we get, it's more difficult to tack back to the scientific goal, but also the economics is still increasingly compelling, especially the further you get away from the eastern seaboard of the United States. And, Ralph made a comment about security being the new buzzword, and he's correct. But it is actually fundamentally around the security of countries And no country is an island, so we can't do it all alone. But we are talking about being able to secure prosperity, secure safety for people, and that is for country around the world. More likely, the cleaner their economy becomes, and the further they move through their energy transition. And that old sort of adage of, well, let's get the energy system clean, or as clean as we can, electrify everything, run it off a clean system, and then begin to bring the benefits of clean electrification to people. They'll start to see the value of the transitions we're in, and this will be more competitive, more sustainable, more long-lasting than this transition away from fossil fuels, which is already underway. We're past peak coal, we're past peak oil. Gas is going to be part of the solution for a number of countries, depending on where they are in the world, but we will have to capture the emissions from that gas. So we have to hold these two things in our minds at the same time, and it's difficult because it's difficult to explain. It's difficult to do. We've never done it before, but that point on the horizon hasn't changed. And there is an extraordinarily embedded, well-financed movement and transigence against this, right? Lots of people do well from the world of the way that it is. And lots of other people are kind of scared about what might happen because it's uncertain. They've never seen it before. But I think, again, we have to be really clear about the amount of disinformation and misinformation that's in the system. And I think that we have failed to find new ways to communicate why the results of these transitions will be good for people, or that there's be greater safety and security in a cleaner world. I think people get it when you start talking about specific things that they can evidence with their own eyes and touch and feel in their own communities. But the language has got away from us and has got away from them. Hannah Arendt was very clear that the purpose of continual lying is not to get people to believe the lie. It is to get people to confuse the ability to differentiate between truth and lies. It is to just sort of, fill the space and make people uncertain, and to make them uncertain, therefore, of their own power to make change. And that's what's going on at the moment, right? I mean, here in the United Kingdom, the majority of our newspapers publish without any fact-checking or clarification a false number for the cost of the government's mission to help the country get to net zero on time. And that's, you can trace where that comes from, you can trace who's paying for it, you can trace how incorrect it is. But that's, rather than having that conversation, we've got to be able to have the conversation door to door with people who can see that the seasons are changing, that the floods are catastrophic and they're coming regularly, and that extreme heat threatens them and threatens their life in public buildings, etc. So just to make a couple of additional points. Here in the UK, for us politically, economically, and in terms of our obligation to the Paris Agreement, the doubling down on the energy transition makes sense. Makes sense because the majority of the people understand that we can't protect ourselves unless we help the world make these transitions. Economically, this will be better off for us. It is the part of the economy that is growing the fastest. It is where we're attracting more investment. And despite bullying from some partners, we're running successful auctions and successful bidding processes to get that investment coming into the country. I think we might talk later about, whether we just need to give up because we're not on track and sort of go to some kind of, carbon removal extravaganza and other things. I think there are pieces of the world that we can see we are going to need, and I'm happy to talk about that, sort of new technologies, so some building the space for a reasonable conversation around some of the technologies that will need to be deployed and the ways in which we protect that under law. And the governance around that. But, as Christiana Figueres famously said, like the week after Melissa, I think after Bill Gates had sort of indicated that he felt that, investing in mitigation wasn't necessarily productive or useful, there isn't any kind of carbon removal that we can engage in right now, or any abandonment of reducing emissions that we could do right now that would protect the people of Jamaica. We've baked it into the system, and we have to keep on fighting to get the emissions down faster in order to be able to protect the most vulnerable. And that brings me to finance. There is a drying up of public finance across the world. We're going to have to find new forms of public finance or new forms of finance from, I think the work that's going on around fiscal policy, around regulatory policy of financial markets, but also whether there are levies or taxes or other specific fundraising sort of mechanisms that we can use. And then do we trust everybody to be able to hypothecate that so that that can actually go into loss and damage funds and go into adaptation? But we're now in a world where fiscal policy has to take into account the threats of resilience worldwide. And in the UK, we are, like many other countries, just coming to the point of realizing that the cost of our own adaptation are going to be extraordinary. We have independent reports from our statutory bodies, and government is going to have to respond. But what's also true is that local organising is really very powerful, and finding ways for local stakeholders to come in and imagine the future and then work backwards. I mean, and I think that this is the democracy that will, that together with the rule of law, we will have to find ways to rely upon. And so the final thing I'd say is that on Saturday last week, the last Saturday, in London, we celebrated the 80th anniversary of the first General Assembly of the United Nations. So yes, it was conceived in San Francisco and all the rest of it, but the first GA was here in Methodist Central Hall, now Westminster Central Hall, a building that stood amongst the ruins and the ashes of the Second World War. It was a powerful and emotional meeting because here we were talking about the vision of a generation of men and women, a lot of women, who had been scarred by war once, twice, in some cases more, and who knew that peace is not for sissies, right? Peace is not naive. We can't get to peace at this point in our existence without ending the war on nature, without being able to act on climate change. And so while the clouds swirl around us and we wake up every morning to try to find out what's happened overnight, we have enough of the sinews still left. It will have to be organized in a different way. Now, so there's the sinews that connects us together. Now, I don't know whether we need an Article 109 process, which is a way to amend the Charter of the United Nations. Having listened to it being read out in a church service on Saturday, it's pretty fit for the future. Obviously, the way in which we organise ourselves in terms of a Security Council, that has to change to be just in the modern world. But the original foresight of the United Nations was there from our forefathers and foremothers. And I just think that we have to keep our eyes focused on that point on the horizon, and we will have to continue to find the ways to build the coalitions, not of the willing, of the working, to keep moving forward. So for the UK, methane's really getting really mundane. Methane's really important. The world is a mess, but if we can make progress on methane, that's 0.5 degree of warming. If we could do it really quickly, that would really buy us more time, more space. We've got to work out how to pay for adaptation, not just mourning the demise of ODA, but finding new creative ways to do it. The transition away from fossil fuels will be important, but country by country needs the international community to help them to imagine what that looks like. And the kinds of requests for support we're getting from countries mean that, Namibia's journey is going to be different from Guyana's, will be different from Nigeria's, will be different from the UK's. So are we good enough to be practical in support of them and not just stand on a soapbox somewhere and wag our fingers and talk about needing to transition away? And can we have it be a healing process and not as toxic and divisive as it was in Belém? So lots of things that we're focusing on in the short run, but in that broader context, I still believe that there is more that unites us and divides us, and that you can see that reflected in the financial markets. You can see that reflected in the security conversation now. It is the Joint Intelligence Committee of the UK that has said that the risk of ecosystem collapse is something that we need to pay attention to. So I think there are other allies, other parts of the system that see what we see, and we will just have to work harder to stay together.
Rachel, thank you so much. And it warms my heart, to be honest, to hear you say that people got together in London and celebrated the birth of modern multilateralism, it's so, I can't imagine that happening in Washington where I live, but it's so hard, so good to hear. I just wanted to say one thing, this point you made about security. It's discussed and countries across the world after Ukraine invasion, energy security has become a top topic for every government in the world. And what we see across the world, very few countries actually have fossil fuel. You can count it in your two hands. So for the rest of the world, energy security is very connected to the transition. So that is what we're seeing. And I'm running out of time, but can I ask you one thing to a quick answer? You did something that is very close to my heart, that we are not succeeding in communicating the benefit of the transition effectively. And you work on this a lot. And I know lots going on in UK right now politically, but can you share with everyone who's listening a successful messaging, like successful in the UK government, where you have succeeded in communicating the benefits?
Well, I think if you go door to door in the UK, people want their electricity bill to be lower. The reason it's high is nothing to do with the cost of renewable energy. It's the cost of the international gas markets. It's the way that we regulated the industry up to now, and that's changing. And, without sounding like one of my bosses, electricity bills will come down by £170 in April, right? So, but that's the first thing. They want affordable electricity. They want reliable electricity. Secondly, they're scared about floods. We're now having, 1 in 100 floods, 2 times a year. And communities are becoming more and more tense around that. Third, our water infrastructure is being affected by many things, but also the change in the weather patterns and the fact that we get these deluges. They're terrified about extreme heat. How do you get to cool? Especially, how do you get to cool when all your hospitals, prisons, and schools are Victorian buildings, right? Never built for this climate. People want to be able to afford their basket of food, right? And increasingly, some of the price spikes that we're seeing are because of things that are happening in the rest of the world. And so they want concerted action. They also want clean and safe communities, right? So they want clean air, etc. So you don't have to go in and talk about net zero or climate change, or, you just talk about, okay, how do we help you meet your needs? And then how do you imagine your community being? Because I think that for some communities, this is going to change the face of their community. For some communities, especially those in extreme vulnerable coastal areas, there are some profound conversations to be had about the future. But we have to find new ways of speaking about that. And so, whether it's citizens' assemblies or other ways of working, which were mentioned in our manifesto, these are things which I think people are looking at. And the final thing is that when I'm talking to other countries, which is mainly my job, right, what people want is fast, clean energy. Fast, reliable, affordable energy. Why fast? Because of data centers and AI. And secondly, they want clean because they don't want to choke up their cities or whatever. So their choice is gas, right? Or renewables. Well, actually, the cheapest, easiest is renewables with batteries. That gives you the dependency you want. But some people are trying to sell them other things, including small modular reactors, which aren't quick. And so again, what
they're not available right now.
And then, exactly. You can't get one even off the back of a Russian lorry. You can't get one. So, what is the answer? The answer is still the transition. And I think this is where the security conversation comes in, which gets us into a whole conversation about the security of supply of critical minerals, which also changes the geopolitics. But, it is difficult to find an answer for why more oil works for most countries. I don't think it does. And the successful and competitive oil countries who know that they will be producing the last barrels of oil in 20 to 30 years, 40 years, they are putting all of their research into how to use that oil without emissions, right? So right. The polymers and the new science that comes from that oil.
Thanks, Rachel. Unfortunately, every oil company I talk to, they think that they have the last barrel of oil. Anyway, Rachel, thank you. I want to move on, Maria Fernanda, to you. because can you bring Maria Fernanda here? There you are. Maria Fernanda, as you already have seen, the transition to fossil fuel, away from fossil fuel, was a big topic and multiple conversation in Belém, and everyone is very excited. You had Mary talk about it, you had Rachel talk about it, about the conference in April that Colombia and Netherlands are organizing. I know a lot of discussion going on right now in Colombia about what give. I'm sure everyone in our listener interested, just to share with us what you're hoping, what the structure, what you're planning to do. I know it's first of many such gathering, but it'll be great, Maria Fernanda, if you can share with us what the plans are.
Thank you very much, Annie, for this invitation. It's a true pleasure and an honor for me to join you today on this distinguished panel representing Colombia's government. And I'm also very pleased to hear that the conference has generated such interest and that its relevance is truly understood. First of all, I would like to start by pointing out that this process does not begin with this conference. Colombia has exercised consistent leadership in multilateral spaces, grounded in respect for multilateralism and a commitment to consensus building. Within the UNFCCC process, we arrived in Belém after sustained efforts to ensure that the climate agenda could no longer avoid this discussion, right? On a just and orderly transition away from fossil fuels, and that this discussion must translate into concrete consensus and coalition and action. In Belém, a couple of months ago, we promoted a more integrated understanding of the transition, emphasizing that it is not possible to advance in climate ambition without simultaneously addressing climate finance, justice, and the effective participation of our communities. For us, the transition cannot fall upon who have contributed least to the crisis, as Mary Robinson pointed out earlier, nor can it be designed detached from territories. Simultaneously, through the COP presidency of biodiversity, our country has worked actively to highlight the intrinsic links between the climate crisis, the phase out of fossil fuels, and the protection of biodiversity, insisting that it is not possible to address the challenges of the climate and civilization crisis separately. This articulation between climate, biodiversity, and socio-ecological justice has been central to Colombia's government and Colombia's international positioning. In coherence with these positions, Colombia has joined initiatives and coalitions such as the Beyond Oil and Gas Alliance, the Fossil Fuel Non-Proliferation Treaty Initiative, and the Coalition on Phasing Out Fossil Fuels initiatives, including subsidies, as part of a broader strategy to encourage, to point out alliances that respond to this urgency of transitioning away from fossil fuels. In these scenarios, Colombia has consistently conveyed a core message. The transition away from fossil fuels must be accompanied by structural reforms and articulated with the strengthening of autonomy, territorial governments, and the collective management of natural resources. It is from this coherence and from the conviction that facts and consensus building are at the heart of this government's approach that we consider urgent today to advance enabling means with the countries and actors with whom we share this understanding. Now, we recognize that countries face different realities. Some are already experiencing severe climate impacts. Others face significant fiscal risks associated with the transition, and many combine both conditions. In this sense, this conference provides a space for those countries and actors who recognize the urgency to engage in dialogue and identify what is needed to make transition pathways feasible, whether through international cooperation, adequate finance, productive reconversion, social protection, or institutional strengthening. The value of this conference lies in building trust and solutions among countries with similar starting points. We also recognize that climate governance has certain scopes and that the conference seeks to fill a gap that currently exists in international climate governance. Although there is growing consensus on the need to gradually eliminate fossil fuels, there were still no specific spaces or meeting places dedicated to comprehensively address the pathways to overcome economic, fiscal, and social dependence on fossil fuels, and particularly in producing countries. For this reason, Colombia, in partnership with the Netherlands, is convening this conference as a space to build and enable the political, financial, and institutional means required to make transition pathways away from fossil fuel viable. The concrete outcome of this meeting will be a set of reports and scientific inputs that clarify practical implementation pathways at critical points of the transition, including overcoming economic dependence, strengthening multilateral cooperation, and addressing supply and demand side dynamics in a coherent and scientific-based manner. The ambition is for the conference to leave an institutional legacy. Its objective is to establish a permanent international platform oriented toward implementation of the transition beyond fossil fuels, one that accompanies a coalition of countries willing to move forward, respect different national circumstances and capacities, and ensure continuity through future editions, and where more countries are committed to this coalition of the willing. The aim, finally, is to prevent this discussion from remaining confined exclusively to COP negotiation cycles, and instead consolidate it as a stable pillar of international climate cooperation. As Irene Vélez, the minister, has said in many spaces, this is not a conference about clean energy in the abstract. It is about how to move away from fossil fuels in a way that protects access, livelihoods, and social rights.
Maria Fernanda, first of all, thank you for sharing. I know there's a lot of conversation going on to shape this, but where you are and where Colombia is, Netherlands is, but as you can hear already, there's so much interest in what's happening because it's so much needed. And I very much agree with what Mary said earlier, and I hear that in your comments, that we need something that is longer term. Transition is not going to happen overnight, and it's beyond COP cycles. We can't have a new conversation every COP. So I like what you just said, that it is going to proceed. So thank you for being here. We are running out of time a little bit, but Ralph, I really wanted to go back to you, and Rachel, if you can be very brief in the next couple of questions. Can I have Ralph back on the screen? Maria Fernanda, thank you so much. And maybe also Rachel. Ralph, I'm very keen to seek your thoughts, because you and the youth groups have been working so much and so instrumental in the International Court of Justice's outcome. Just on that path, Ralph, what do you think we can do more given the advisory we received? on that particular dimension?
So when the advisory opinion was handed down, there was a judge on the ICJ panel, Judge Nolte, who made a separate declaration, and he questioned whether the advisory opinion would be used as a vehicle for litigation to compensate for the lack of political will, or whether it would be used to reinforce the commitment of states to tackle climate change through legally framed forms of political and administrative cooperation. So that's a quote, which could be potentially complemented by litigation. And he suggested that the first route, the litigation route, would be counterproductive and result in unintended effects, but the latter route would potentially make a lasting contribution. So we reflected on this a lot. And right now, Vanuatu is leading the negotiations for the General Assembly resolution that is required to welcome and operationalize the advisory opinion with a core group of states. And I want to acknowledge and thank Colombia through Maria Fernanda, who is on the core group of states, which is working with us on the text of the resolution, which will be released to all member states on the 30th of this month, January. One challenge with this task of the resolution has been to figure out how to firstly solidify the gains we've made through the advisory opinion and its contributions to international law. And to do this, we need to ensure that the AO is welcomed as broadly as possible by the UN membership by supporting the resolution. But secondly, we want to operationalize the advisory opinion so that it can fulfill its potential in making what was called a lasting contribution via legally framed forms of political and administrative cooperation. The welcome is relatively straightforward, but the second one, we need a considered approach that will gain sufficient support, particularly in the current global political context. So one that we see as having real teeth is to include the establishment of a register of damage and potentially a mechanism for climate reparation under the UNJ, UN General Assembly, or a subsidiary body. This is important to avoid having the processes driven or vetoed by a few states whose interests are threatened by the AO. And we've seen this already at COP30 with the red line refusal to have any mention of the advisory opinion in the outcome from COP30. And this is the architecture we think is needed to bridge the authoritative clarifications of international law provided by the ICJ and transparent, inclusive, and enforceable multilateral processes firmly rooted in international law and state responsibility. And we think that climate inaction will be addressed as a consequence of having clearer accountability mechanisms in place. Personally, however, I believe it's in the realm of domestic courts in which the advisory opinion from the ICJ would have the most transformative effect. Citizens forcing their own governments to make changes in law and policy through legal action. And almost immediately after the advisory opinion was handed down in July last year, we saw it starting to be referenced in litigation across states all over the world. And so this was the advisory opinion helping to provide real teeth to cases in jurisdictions to force governments to change policy and law. And I think we'll see a proliferation of these kind of cases, which will result in, some game-changing effect of the advisory opinion.
Well, thank you. And I thank you for highlighting the domestic possibilities that you mentioned. I also get stuck, the fact that in your comments, how important organizations like UN are actually. You said accountability. Actually, UN has been relatively not good in holding countries accountable. But both Rachel and Mary talked about the changes that needed in the UN. It's interesting how important it is and what we need to do differently. Rachel, we have a lot of great questions, but I'm dying to ask you one question. It's actually triggered by conversations you've had a lot about how finance, you mentioned yourself, how finance is critical transition. And we have talked about, you and I talked about how private capital is so important, not just public capital, and will play. And there was a very depressing article 2 days back in New York Times, how private capital actually, which said a lot of good things about climate, actually is moving away from it, at least rhetorically. I'd love to hear your thoughts, because London, the city, plays such an important role in this. What are you seeing, and what do you think is the future of private capital flows in the countries that need most? I asked you a big question. I'm sorry if you can be
No, I'll
patient.
try and keep it. No, it's fine. Thank you. Well, I think uncertainty is never a great environment for making big bets, except for the people who thrive in that environment, right? And one of the really big problems that we have is that the private finance that is still going into renewable energy in particular is in the developed world. It's not going in, we're not galvanizing it into emerging markets and developing economies. The banks and other investors books were full last year of renewable energy in the United States, but that's probably because it was the tail end of the subsidies and the incentives under the Inflation Reduction Act. They come to an end, and it'll be interesting to see how robust investment into the US continues to be. But that just shows you that even in a hostile business environment for renewable energy, people see that is the way of the future. So the question of how do we get more finance flowing into emerging markets, developing economies, is critical. That's going to need for grid infrastructure, for interconnectors, and for transformers, the pieces that allow you to then capture the renewable energy and put it into your energy system. We're going to still need some public money. And so we have to judiciously use that, and all of the capital is sitting in the MDB system, etc. It needs to be more aggressive. It needs to move more quickly. Countries need to have the regulatory frameworks in place for that kind of stuff, and then we have to find ways of bringing the private capital alongside. And I think there's enough appetite. That needs much more data transparency. We've been talking about this for years. We've been walking at a slow pace. We should congratulate the MDBs and others for the GEMS database. This basically allows everybody who's investing in emerging markets to say, hey, this is our track record. Oh, guess what? We haven't hemorrhaged and we haven't lost billions of dollars. We've done very well, thank you. And so this needs to be even more complete than it is at the moment. And I think it's completely unacceptable for any MDB to say it's going to take them years rather than months to populate that database. And then secondly, we need to also start acting on some of the research that's been done that would show that if we re-rated or re-risk rated the MDBs against what they actually are doing, then I think it would be much more attractive and we'd be able to entice much more private capital. So there are things we've been talking about for 5 years that we can actually do. And then secondly, I think we really do need to kickstart, however difficult the geopolitics are, the debt conversation. It is impossible to imagine that countries that are evacuating more capital to private equity, to developed countries and to other debt holders than they can bring into the country. How are you supposed to invest in your resilience? So this is something we're looking at quite carefully. It comes up in the Circle of Climate Finance Ministers. It comes up in the Coalition of Finance Ministers for Climate Change. It comes up everywhere. But so I think there are things that we know that we need to do, and we've got to find somewhere and galvanize the political will, not by everybody, but by key players to do it. And this will be cheaper than kicking the can down the road.
I agree. Rachel, thank you. One thing Rachel said about the financial market, though it's not going to global south where we want to, but actually in the S&P 500, S&P index for transition finance actually beat S&P 500 last year. Even in the United States, even in a hostile environment. So it's kind of interesting to see where finance is in this. Rachel, thank you very much. Mohammed, if I can ask you to come and help us wrap up this panel. We have really exciting questions that I want to get to. Mo, how are you? I want to go to your favorite topic, which is something I'm keenly interested in, is about the narrative. Where the narrative is, where the narrative needs to go, what kind of stories we need to tell going forward. Mo, over to you.
Thank you, Ani. And I think the most important one, perhaps, and the most decisive one, is that the transition away from fossil fuels is no longer a fringe issue. Even if the politics have yet to catch up with the science, I think what developing countries, including those developed countries that committed to a transition away from fossil fuels in Belém, have demonstrated is that we need to press for a fair and equitable transition. But that will require more than a process, and it will require tangible action as we've had in this conversation now, credible finance, and sustained political will. And that would need to be mobilized. And so there is something I think that we need to take away, and particularly the opportunity that Colombia is providing, particularly the world. It's obviously going to be difficult to get the buy-in of all major emitters, but leadership doesn't have to wait for unanimity. And I think this is something that is important for our narrative. History shows us that progress often starts with coalitions of willing countries. When a critical mass moves, that sets standards, that shifts finance, that scales clean technologies, others tend to follow because of the economics of change. So we are already seeing this with the renewables, which are now cheaper than fossil fuels in much of the world. And COP30, I think, is the second story perhaps for me, is COP30 showed us the limits of the UN process. Many countries wanted a roadmap towards a fossil fuel phase out, but a small group of petrostates blocked it. That said, the COP and the UNFCCC process still plays an important role in setting direction, defining norms, and providing a forum where vulnerable countries can challenge powerful polluters. They are imperfect tools, but for now, they remain central to global climate governance. Also, as the impact of climate change bite even harder and clean energy continues, the meteoric rise, the strength of the fossil fuel bloc will weaken. And I think it's important for us to sort of recognize that in the stories we tell. The third thing I wanted to say is on Colombia and why this particular conference is important. And we've had this from Maria Fernanda. This is explicitly about ending fossil fuel dependence, not just reducing emissions. And secondly, it brings together governments willing to move faster, alongside, of course, civil society, labor, indigenous groups, and climate vulnerable countries. And the third thing for me is the focus on implementation rather than aspirational targets. And I think that is something we need to embrace. The third point I wanted to make is the attacks on the spirit of multilateralism. And this is something we've had and how that is hurting progress. I need to point out a very important issue regarding the ongoing attacks on the spirit of multilateralism. As the battles rage and leaders flex muscles, as we've started to see, climate finance, which is the fulcrum of action, is going to become more elusive. And for vulnerable countries, the most vulnerable countries, will rely on multilateral channels such as UN funds, development banks, climate facilities to finance, the energy transition, climate adaptation. If those systems weaken, finance could become more fragmented, more political, and more expensive. And so the more this happens, the more climate vulnerable countries risk losing critical leverage. The multilateral forums are the only avenues through which vulnerable countries act collectively. We've seen leaders use these spaces to actually amplify their voices and push issues like, the phase out of fossil fuels, loss and damage fund, adaptation, debt reform onto the global agenda. And so this is something I think we need to be conscious about. And the third point I want to make in relation to multilateralism, based on the conversation we've had, as climate action risks becoming securitized in our fractured global order, climate is less likely to be treated as a shared responsibility and more as a geopolitical bargaining chip. And with vulnerable countries pressure to trade, resources, particularly critical minerals or energy access for short-term political support, I think we have seen this starting to happen, and I think it's something we need to be conscious about. And then the final point I want to make in terms of narratives and the stories we want to see told, I think as a climate story about the world and particularly about vulnerable countries, that the global media and many others are most likely to miss is the scale and urgency of adaptation needs. And I don't think we've had this enough in this call. I think climate vulnerable countries are already experiencing some of the most severe climate impacts in the world, yet they receive only a fraction of the finance needed to adapt for flood protection, drought resilience, food systems, health, early warning systems. And this is not a future problem. It's a present crisis that is already shaping lives and economies right now. So with the global coverage heavily focused on the important task of the transition away from fossil fuels, we risk treating adaptation as a secondary issue. And for vulnerables, this is essential. And I think we need to find a way to elevate, because this really leads into the headlines.
Thank you, Mohammed. Thank you. Actually, this adaptation question, the point you made is so relevant, and actually, there's an excellent question on that. I would like to bring all the panelists back. They're really good questions. We don't have that much time left. Emily, can you bring, including Mary? Is Mary still here? Yeah. If you can get everyone here. I'm going to start with Mary, if you are here. Yeah, there you are. It's a very good question, and I'm going to read it because it's very well written. And I plead with all of you, because these are not easy questions. If you can be super brief, then I can get to as many questions as possible, because they're really good questions. So Mary, the question is written. I'm going to read it out. Climate collapse, ecological destruction, inequity, and injustice all arise from ideological and military dominance of neoliberal capitalism. This is a question someone wrote. Okay, Barry. How can these crises be addressed without the support of the United States? This is an excellent question.
Yeah, I agree. It is a very good question. It can be addressed with that part of the United States which is still in. That's important. California is still in. A number of other states are still in. Cities are still in. We saw before Belém in both Rio and São Paulo, cities and subregions and business very vocal, and the United States was a very key part of that. So we have to distinguish between President Trump at the federal level and the wrong he's doing, if I can put it that way, and so much of America wanting to be still in and encourage that and make it more visible, because it is an important part of needing to change the system. There was actually, I think, in Davos before Trump spoke, there was supposed to be an alternative Davos speech by a whole lot of friends of mine, Earth for All and the Earth Commission and others, who had come together to work on a speech that was an alternative to Trump. Now, because I've been here, I haven't heard either Trump or the alternative, but I'm looking forward to looking for the alternative and encourage people to do that.
Mary, I couldn't agree with you more. There are a very large part of the United States that I live here that is still there. Cities, people, communities who believe in this. So thank you, Mary. Ralph, I want to go to you next. It's a question that Mohammed just already raised. The question is, how can we move from commitments to actually deliver adaptation support? And in spite of tripling adaptation commitment in Belém, the outcome, the actual action on the ground, Rachel also raised it earlier. Ralph, over to you. How can we shape global strategies for more actual adaptation action in the world?
In my country, all development is adaptation. That is what sustainable development is, adaptation. There isn't any sustainable development that is not adaptation. So, and we are also, of course, now well into loss and damage. So it's just trying to focus everything we can on just building the resilience of our people, building the resilience of our infrastructure, all our systems, our communities, through building resilience in the governance structures all the way to the infrastructure and the technology we use. And it's simple things like water supply, electrification, education, health. This is all adaptation for us. And so it's trying to find ways to creative ways to access, and I agree wholeheartedly that we're seeing the finance drying up. So we are trying to find ways, different creative ways to continue having a flow of finance which can help us to continue that adaptation action. The big challenge for us is when these enormous extreme weather events happen, right? That put us back, cut out 50-60% of our GDP in one event and just put us back, and we're just continually having to rebuild, recover, an endless cycle. The way to keep that out of the normal adaptation that we're doing, and we've done things like we've passed legislation to allocate proportion of our budget purely for response. We had to increase that 2 times in the last decade or so, but trying to find a way to make sure that while we continue to respond to these ever increasing frequency and extremity of these natural disasters, continue to maintain this adaptation finance. And we continue to, as Mohammed said, we have to engage in these multilateral processes. We are a very small player in the international order. We have no choice but to hope that the rules-based order is going to survive, is going to improve, is going to become better than it is now, is going to become more science-based and based on international law, so that we can have those pledges that were made at Paris, that were made at Belém, that were made in Dubai, can become actually real for us.
Right. Thank you. Thank you very much. Maria Fernanda, next question is for you. It's actually a pretty significant question, but you have to be very brief in your answer, so I can get to Rachel and Mohammed after you. The question is that exactly what Ralph was saying. The question is saying the World Bank projections show that climate change could significantly cut the GDP of Colombia. And Colombia is not the only country that data is for, but it is actually for Colombia. There's a World Bank report. So the question is, how is Colombia preparing for it?
Wow.
I know. You have to be quick. This is a big question.
Yes, I'm going to try to be brief. Yeah, effectively, Colombia has explicitly recognized that the climate crisis constitutes not only an environmental challenge, but also a structural risk to the economy and social well-being. So for this reason, we have promoted responses to this crisis on 2 fronts. One of them is strengthening adaptation as a response to impacts that are already affecting key sectors. We have to adapt as we understand these impacts are happening right now, but on the other hand, acknowledging that adaptation alone is insufficient. And if we don't transform the structural drivers of vulnerability, and particularly those associated with carbon-intensive economies and high exposure to climate vulnerability. So from this perspective, strengthening adaptation does not simply mean designing responses to climate impacts and disasters, but rather reducing the underlying causes of vulnerability. And this requires actions simultaneously on highly exposed territories, governments, arrangements, access to land and property. In the case of Colombia, this is quite a very important issue, as well as on carbon-intensive productive and energy systems that amplify climate risks. So there are a lot of things happening. One of them is that Colombia has incorporated energy sovereignty and access to energy as a central dimension of adaptation, recognizing that the strengthening of local capacities to produce, manage, and access energy reduces this vulnerability. Simultaneously, the country has advanced in productive conversion and reconversion pathways, accompanied by what we call a just labor transition, for sectors with higher environmental impacts. And this is embedded in NDCs Colombia's presented to the UNFCCC last year. At the same time, we have committed to recognizing and strengthening value chains that are compatible with nature as part of a strategy to reduce climate and economic risk, such as bioeconomy, nature-based tourism, sustainable productive systems, and the transition toward agroecological models. Another key measure that has been implemented in Colombia is to curb deforestation and reinforce the protection and restoration of strategic ecosystems. And in this sense, Colombia has advanced in reinforcing the priority of conserving and restoring the Amazonian ecosystems.
Thank you, Maria. I think that's it. It's a lot of steps you're taking. Thank you. I just want to make sure we finish in time. Rachel, there is a question for you, which you already started addressing about the overshoot, 1.5 degree. And it's I think, a very relevant question. Would love to hear your thoughts. Then the question, I'm reading it out. Should we focus on implementing the Paris Agreement with rising ambition instead of chasing radical changes that could undo decades of progress?
I mean, we have to pursue the temperature goal from Paris at full throttle. We've talked a lot about fossil fuels here, but we have to protect in particular the tropical forest basins. This is our ultimate protection. We have so much to do to invest in nature so it can continue to protect us and act as a sink for the pollution we continue to spew forth. So that all has to happen. At the same time, obviously, science and technology advances. And so we are in a world also where we have to be able again to walk and chew gum. Women find this very easy, by the way. So we will need to bring governments together around how we are going to govern and put parameters up and advise for the testing of new ways of thinking about how we interact with the weather systems, etc. These cats are out of the bag. There is extraordinary amounts of private money being raised. There's public money being put into understanding more about some of these technologies. I'm not calling for their deployment, and that is not the UK's government position. But given who's out there and who's already working on these things, we need to have the foresight to be able to talk about the things that are happening and how we will, as an international community, make sure that they benefit everybody. But that doesn't change the sort of thing that we have to have at the front of our mind when we get up every morning, which is transitioning away justly from fossil fuels, financing green electrons, because you can't ask governments to switch off dirty electrons until they've got green electrons to provide to their people. And so that's finance, that's transitioning away. And it is an urgency to the need to protect, in the first instance, tropical forest zones, but then the mangroves and seagrasses, which protect people and also provide livelihoods. Lots and lots of good things going on in those spaces, as WRI well knows. But the idea that we just give up on emissions reduction because there might be some guy in a tin hat somewhere that has a whiz-bang idea is absurd. We shouldn't discount the need for managing some of the new technologies which are on the horizon. But in the meantime, we have to pursue efficiency, effectiveness of those things that we know that work, that we've got to do more of.
Thank you, Rachel. We're actually out of time, but I love this one question that I'm going to go. You have only one sentence you can say, okay? One sentence. A really good question. It doesn't apply to me because I'm genetically optimistic, so it might apply to all of you. This is the question. Mo, I'm going to go to you. Rachel, I'm going to come to you next because I know you have to leave soon. So this is the question. How do you personally keep hope alive in your own lives, for your family, and for your future generation? So the question is, how do you personally keep hope alive? Mo, you first.
We don't have a planet B.
One sentence.
Yes, we don't have a planet B, and we can only depend on each other to help protect everything that we have in our planet and make sure we don't cross the limits.
Maria Fernanda, thank you, Mo.
Thank you. Yes, actually, I'm going back to the first words we heard in this webinar, and is that we need more action, we need to go farther, and we need to be more ambitious because the time is now. Thank you.
Ralph.
Yeah, to echo Mohammed said, we have no choice. We We have no choice. We have to do it because our future, especially for island states, our future is an existential question for us and our children and our grandchildren.
Agree. Mary, you have the last word.
Well, I learned how to cope personally from Archbishop Tutu, who was accused of being an optimist and said, oh no, he was a prisoner of hope. And hope was action. It was doing what you can do and only you can do as your contribution, and believing that you must, even if the glass is only half full, and I know I'm beyond the first sentence, but just to explain the prisoner of hope, the glass may not be half full, there may be only a tiny bit in it, but you work with that, you collaborate, you grow it, you do what you can do, and you work as much as possible in community with others, and that is the way you bring hope.
Thank you, Mary. I agree with you very much. There's a lot to be hopeful for. And thank you all for joining. Please join me in thanking this fantastic panel. Thank you all for your partnership, for your friendship and collaboration. Hope to see you down the road. Thank you all, and thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you.